I'm pleased to announce that we have our media panel today of these incredible journalists that we've been working with over the past couple of years. Vicky Spratt unfortunately couldn't make it here today because she's been pulled in to write a story on something that we're talking about later on this afternoon. So that's a good excuse. She's fighting the good fight, but from a laptop in central London somewhere. And you'll hear all about the data from Catherine Mell later on that. So pleased to announce that we've got Dan Hewitt from ITV News, Hannah Miller from political correspondent for BBC News, and Michael Buchanan, social affairs from BBC News as well. We're going to have a bit of a robust conversation on kind of the involvement of the media in telling the story of the families and the children that we work with each and every day. And then we'll throw it out to the audience, and then you can interview the interviewers. So we'll see how that goes. Thank you so much for joining me. We'll just go down the line. I'll see the same question to start off with. How did you get into the role that you're doing now? Why do you do what you do?
Well, thank you for having us, first of all. And I said outside to Sam, it was a huge mistake having us after Quajo, because it's going to be really underwhelming in the shadow of Quajo, as we all are. So I, nearly 4 years ago, kind of stumbled upon a story in Croydon in South London. We were working on what I thought would sort of be a bog standard news report about people living in poor social housing conditions. We'd been seeing some Facebook groups pop up of people living in poor conditions, and we found ourselves in a tower block in Croydon and walked inside this tower block and found people living in the worst conditions you could possibly ever imagine. Leaks, mold, damp across the walls, the floor completely drenched, but more than that, light bulbs filling with water. The electric had to be cut off because families were at risk of electrocution, and they'd been telling the council about this for months and getting absolutely nowhere. And those people, some of them were living in temporary accommodation at the time. We were appalled by what we found. We ran a story on News at 10 on ITV, and the response to that story was enormous. We had literally hundreds of emails the following day, some from viewers who were appalled by what we'd reported on, but the majority from other social housing tenants, some in temporary accommodation, some permanently housed by housing associations or councils, saying that they too were living in really, really squalid, dangerous conditions. And we ran another report and we got the same response. And so we just kept going and going. And we got in contact with Quajo, and we worked with Quajo to expose what was happening on his estate in Eastfields, which I'm sure you talked a little bit about. And that's how we got into the story, really. I'm very grateful to ITV News, who on the face of it could have seen this as a local story in South London in one tower block, and they saw it for what I saw for what it was as well, which was a pattern. There was something going on here. This is the way people were being treated in Britain. This was more than a story about housing. It was a story about power, about who gets listened to, who doesn't get listened to, and why people are so easily ignored. And as we went on in the investigation, which still goes on to this day, we started about 18 months ago getting lots of emails from people to our inbox about people living in hotels and hostels and bed and breakfasts who'd been made homeless, some who'd rented for years and never had a problem, but suddenly were finding themselves priced out, evicted out of the market. And we then started seeing kind of an avalanche of people who were becoming homeless and trapped in these really unsuitable housing conditions. And we did a big investigation last summer into temporary accommodation, and found children living in really poor conditions, but also living in conditions, even if they weren't poor in terms of quality, were totally unsuitable for their development. We found a school in South London where over half the children, a primary school in South London where over half the children were homeless. 160 kids were living in temporary accommodation. They were travelling sometimes an hour and a half across the capital to go to school every morning because that's where they'd been placed. They would sometimes go to school one morning from one hotel or bed and breakfast, and then return home to another that evening because their parents had been moved again. These were families sometimes who had jobs, who were working, but just couldn't afford to live anywhere else. One conversation I had with one little boy, an 8-year-old called Callis, will sort of stay with me forever, I think, really, where he'd been living in a travel lodge in Enfield for nearly 8 months, and we went and played football together, and we sat down on the grass, and I said, "What's your dream? What do you want to do with your life?" And he said, "I want a permanent place to live, and I want to stay there." And I remember thinking, wow, if you ask any of your children or nieces or nephews what their dreams are, I doubt they'd say somewhere permanent to live and to stay there. And so I sort of started seeing firsthand really the impact on children and the impact this crisis is having on kids it's kind of robbing them of their futures. It's having kind of untold damage on them, on not only their mental and physical health, but also their kind of view of authority, view of power. I think it's really worrying. Sort of living transient lives in temporary homes is no way to grow up. So that's how we started. I think the media has a really important role to play. I'm sure we'll come on to it as to why in the past maybe it hasn't been covered. I think it should. And I've been encouraged recently, partly through Quajo's work and through the work of these guys and others, that I think this issue is getting more attention, sadly, because it's getting worse. But also I think people are starting to see the value in these stories because something has to change. But that's how we started, and the story continues.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Hannah, same question.
I don't really know how I'm going to follow that, to be honest. But thanks for having me. It's a privilege to be here, especially alongside these two. For me, so I now work for the BBC in Westminster, and therefore a lot of my work at the moment is seeing everything more through the kind of political angle of what is going on. To answer the question in terms of how I got into this and why I mean, I say why I care, doesn't everyone care? Yeah. But kind of, but I did, my experience of going into temporary accommodation and doing more stories around homelessness was more actually in regional news, which I think tends to be much closer to the ground and to people's experiences. And perhaps that's something we can come on to in terms of how things are covered. I remember in particular going to speak to one woman who had children who was homeless in Preston many years ago now. And, you know, it's kind of in some ways, I think, the same as what Dan was saying. There are stories that you do, and we all do stories, and you kind of move on, or you don't think about them that much afterwards. I still to this day kind of wonder how she's doing, and that kind of moment and that thing that really sticks with you. So having moved to Westminster, I see it as something that it's an important cause to champion. It's an important issue that often does get forgotten amid the whole news cycle and everything else that is going on in Westminster. In relation to shared health in particular, in the COTS campaign, that was interesting because I'd seen it, I'd seen the campaign, really hugely important, great issue. But when I took it to a news editor at first, I was being told, we can't do a campaign. It's a campaign. What's the story here? And that was really important in terms of getting it on. We ended up doing it on the website, but seeing it as kind of, for me, what conversations were happening with ministers, what was happening, what wasn't happening, what was really going on behind the scenes, turned it into a story from a political point of view that I was able to tell in the way that the issue, while hugely important, and I'm really pleased that the campaign had the success that it had, kind of from my perspective in my current job, I couldn't just say, well, here's a great campaign, let's write about that in and of itself. It needed to have that kind of what's going on behind the scenes and the tensions here, and how can we tell that story. And I think as Dan said, there has been a bit of a shift. I think things are starting to get more attention, but maybe we'll come on to that in a sec.
Great. Michael.
I'm listening to the guys and thinking about what's happened over. But I've been doing this story for about a decade. In various guises, and the fact that I have done so many stories that say the number of people in temporary accommodation is at record levels. I mean, increasingly now, but over the years, it's probably, you have to reflect on yourself when you do these kind of stories, when you're constantly doing a version of the same story. And where I come from it is that I feel a little bit of a failure, because I have been to so many different temporary accommodation properties all over the country. I've approached it from different angles. I spent a week with a council housing team when the people are coming in and asking for accommodation, and then you see from the council officer's perspective how they deal with people. And I remember we did something, and this is years ago, and I'll come on to why in a second, but years ago, we spent time with a council in East London, and there was dozens and dozens and dozens of people coming in looking for accommodation. And we had access to both the people looking for accommodation and to the officers who were making the decisions as to where to put them. And if they were unsure whether the person was telling the truth, they had a hostel they had one in Wembley and they had one in Slough. And they would offer somebody they were unsure about, either the Wembley or the Slough one, because they figured that if they were really homeless, they would go to Wembley or they would go to Slough. But if the council officers thought that they were maybe at it, the people would, in the view of the council officers, they would decline the accommodation. And you think, well, that's really, really harsh and unfair on all these people. But then you get a sense of the council's pressures that they are under. I mean, the amount of money that they were spending was extraordinary, and they had pressures themselves. And so you get an insight from that perspective. We did some stuff a number of years ago on when the Conservative government started allowing office blocks to be converted into accommodation with no real planning permission necessary. We ended up in the middle of an industrial site in southwest London, where there were articulated lorries and recycling lorries driving around the estate. And what was the office block of this industrial complex had been turned into single bedroom accommodation. And 3 London councils were housing hundreds of people in the middle of this industrial estate. And one of the people that we met had lost her baby in the block, because when her husband went to phone the ambulance when she develop a problem, the ambulance couldn't find the location because it wasn't a residential postcode that they gave. And so he was trying to desperately guide the ambulance into the middle of this industrial estate, where she was trying to make her way down from 2 flights of stairs. She made it as far as the car park, but by the time the ambulance arrived, her baby had unfortunately died. And the reason I mention any of this is because I've been doing it for years, and it might sound strange for me to say that. I'm delighted that ITV are doing this. You are brilliant at what you were doing. But by doing it, it has sometimes felt for a number of years as though I wouldn't say I was the only voice. I was never the only voice, but it felt if you're in a competitive news environment and you're the only person doing these stories, then at some point people think, well, if you say it's that bad, why isn't anybody else doing it? And the fact that ITV in particular in recent years have done it as well and done it brilliantly, I'm a bit jealous, but they've done it brilliantly. but they have given me the space as well to continue to do it, because editors and news programs are very, very competitive environments. They're competitive within an organization. There are only so many slots in a program, and they're competitive against other organizations as well. So, like I said, I've been at it forever, and I think there has been a change in how people view this. I think the name temporary accommodation needs a think, because I think it's a barrier to people understanding what is going on, because it sounds as though people have got property and they're only going to be there for a little while. And so you have to unpick that and explain that almost before you get to the point of what's going on in people's lives. So that's the perspective I've taken on it. And as I said, I'm delighted that ITV and Sky are picking up it as well now. And the more, I think, essentially, considering the scale of the problem, the more coverage it gets, the more likely it is to actually lead to a difference, because people come at it from different perspectives.
And from the past decade that you've been reporting on this issue, what trends have you seen happen in that time, or what has changed, apart from obviously the numbers going up every single year? Are you still reporting on the same kind of housing issues, or has there been new things happening in the past few years as the numbers have grown? Have new issues emerged?
I think I'd say 3 things on that. I'd say the impact of immigration has meant that the system doesn't work, and in terms of everybody looks at it from their own budget's perspective. And when I say the impact of immigration is you now have a situation where you have got the Home Office competing with local councils for a scarce amount of properties, and the Home Office doesn't, or the Home Office contractor doesn't have the same financial restrictions as the councils do. So that creates an extraordinary competition for such a scarce resource. Secondly, I'd say that the financial pressure on councils has become really, really acute. in the past decade, and the costs of these properties are incredible for the council. So if you look at Hastings, for instance, council in the south of England, one of its problems is got a lot of temporary accommodation. It's spending an awful lot of money on temporary accommodation. But what they say is that landlords know that they have a problem. So landlords are buying properties in Hastings to turn them into temporary accommodation, knowing that they can then get properties, get people and money from the council. So it's almost become, on that level, a vicious circle. And the other thing I would say is the impact of companies like Airbnb. You know, Airbnb has become really, really popular, and we all use it. But it's meant that more and more properties have been taken out of the potential rental market, and so the pressure to actually get a house has become even more intense, I'd say.
Yeah. Okay. Dan, what's still surprising you?
Gosh. Well, I mean, this could be the bleakest panel ever. To say.
We'll get to the hopeful bits in a bit, don't worry.
Let's just keep going. Yeah, I mean, last year we went to, similar to you saying about where that poor lady lost her baby, we went to several parts of North London where people were living in sort of shipping containers. They were literally shipping containers converted into houses, kind of piled on top of one another. And absolutely boiling in the summer, freezing in the winter. And I just remember sitting outside, it was in my car, about to go inside to meet another family. It was just tipping down with rain, about to go in. And just thought, how do we get here as a country?
How do you think we've got here?
I think the state has retreated far too far from the housing market. I think if you look at life in its sort of most basic form, you want somewhere decent to live, you want a decent school for your kids or your family, and you want somewhere to be treated if you get sick. And if you look at the housing compared to education, health, which has its own problems, the state has retreated so far from housing, which is a commodity. It's been treated as a commodity rather than as a need. I think if you not make it too political, and people will look at the right to buy and say it was a good policy in some ways, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But the point being is, if you can't argue with the facts, more than 1 million social homes have been taken out of the market in the last 40 or so years. And the reasons why you have people living in shipping containers and people living in hotels and hostels, there's not enough affordable homes to rent for people. And you can kind of tinker around the edges as much as you want, but until you have a program that effectively puts more houses available in the market, and the market has not provided those houses, but why would it? Why would someone who's out to make money, which is fine, build houses that don't make them any money? That's the state's job. If you ask the market to build hospitals, it wouldn't build hospitals for poor people, it'd build them for rich people. Same with schools. So for me, it is, and I don't think that's that controversial. Maybe I'm allowed a tiny bit more slack working for ITV or on the BBC, but I don't think it's controversial to say that there's not enough houses, and that is the state's role.
Yeah.
And if we are seeing, I think, the consequences of 40 years of not building enough.
Yeah.
And that's pretty simple, I think.
Hannah, what is Westminster saying, if anything, about this?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's not controversial to say there's not enough houses, and I work for the BBC, and I will say that. But I think Dan's made some really interesting points there in terms of kind of the role of the state within the housing market. There is definitely more of a conversation about housing going on. I don't know what's in the budget any more than any other journalist and things, but the fact that is even being talked about in terms of social housing in sort of preview type headlines is a shift from where we were. That doesn't mean to say that it's necessarily going anywhere near far enough. I think we're at a point where there's a kind of recognition and an acknowledgement that there's a problem that people feel strongly about, that they want to fix. But as you've just heard, in terms of the way of fixing it is potentially quite radical in terms of where we've ended up as a country, where we are now and where we need to be. That is a huge shift. And I mean, we've been hearing only this week about, let's have a national conversation about the role of the NHS. Well, where's the national conversation about the role of the government in housing. And we know that they're looking at right to buy to some extent, and there's consultation about that. But all of these things, to me, feel like probably reasonable conversations to be having about the right issues to be talking about, but whether they're really thinking radically enough to solve such a huge crisis, I think is quite a big question still.
Yeah, and to be clear, the state is playing a big role in the housing market. It's paying £30 billion a year in housing benefit. So if you're a government, you either decide you believe in state intervention or you don't. And for the last few decades, we've decided as a country, successive governments decided that the role of the government is not to build en masse social housing. But that doesn't mean it's retreated from housing. It means it's just all it's done is put the housing benefit bill up and up and up and up to a completely unsustainable point. So we're still spending billions of pounds on housing. It's just going to often to landlords to house people that can't afford to live in those houses. So the money is there to be built. The problem we've got as a country now, we've got ourselves in a situation where you can't turn one tap on without losing money elsewhere. And we've gone so far now that a kind of a mass house building program akin to the 1950s and 60s is going to be incredibly expensive. Now everyone agrees that but if you do it, you'll get the money back eventually because you'll get that bill will come down and people's health, and there's lots of ways. But you're asking government to do something that they're not going to get the credit for. And that's a slight problem across Europe, in America, you're seeing everywhere. You're asking politicians to make decisions they will not get the political capital for, and that's a problem. I don't know how you really address that. I think it's really difficult.
Michael, let's talk about the people involved in temporary accommodation. How do you best tell the story of the families and the children in the midst of all the complications of governments and things like that? How do you break through the noise of what party, flavour, colour, whatever should be doing, tell the lived experience of the children in a way that's meaningful, that doesn't re-traumatise them or make them more vulnerable?
I think the key to all these stories is to talk to the people involved, not the people who know the people involved. So you start from that perspective, and and that includes, as often as possible and as often as appropriately, talking to the children and not just their parents, because you get a different and a more powerful perspective from the child. And as Daniel was saying about the little kid he was with at the hotel in was it Enfield, he said, those insights from single-digit age children, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds, into what it's actually like. I think because they've got an ability to cut through, their parents are come at it from a number of different angles. They've got the stress, they've got the relationship they're trying to have with the council. They've got all the logistics of life to cope with, as well as being in the situation they're in. But sometimes a child can just cut through it in the way that little kid did with Daniel, or in the way that several others have done. I think of a kid in the West Midlands I met who he lived in fear of being homeless, and he'd constantly ask his mother whether she had enough money today, because he could see the pressure that this was creating for her. So I think the key is to try and get to the children and the families, obviously as a starting point, but then to give them the space and the freedom to tell their own story. You ask open questions. You don't lead them anywhere. You just ensure that they have an opportunity to say whatever they want to say. And I think keeping it really simple is the key as well, and which takes me back to the point I made about temporary accommodation. It's a terrible concept to have to explain to a mainstream audience, because it's essentially, it requires a little bit of understanding as to what it is, and you have to explain it to them. So that sometimes can get in the way of telling the human story, but the human story is what matters most. And we go to an awful lot of lengths to ensure that the people that we feature are ready to be featured, because sometimes you meet some people and they have some extraordinary stories to tell, and the journalist in you thinks, oh, that's going to go really well. But then you've always got to have the human being in you as well, and you think, you know what, that would be a brilliant story, but it's not right to tell it at the moment, and maybe it never will be right, and that's fine, because you can't ever put pressure on people in these circumstances. And talking more generally, we, all of us, I think, deal with vulnerable people all the time. And some of these relationships can last for years. They can last for years. I spoke to a family yesterday who I've been speaking to for 18 months and have finally committed to doing an interview in a month's time. And it's quite likely that I will be in contact with that family for something in the region of 3 to 5 years after the piece is aired. Not all journalists are the same, is the one thing I'd say, and I think I speak for all three of us. We're all responsible, and so if you've got access to people that you think their stories should be told, responsible journalists will tell those stories in the right manner to make the point that the family want to make. Maybe it may not be the point that your organisation wants to make, but it'll be the point that the family wants to make. And that's the key, is respecting the family and giving them the space and the freedom to say what they want to say, rather than having a perspective on what you'd like them to say.
Anyone else want to add on to that?
I would just add into that the kind of sense of from when the family say what they want to say. I imagine we've all had situations where you go in and you think, oh, this isn't quite what I thought it was going to be. What I've told the editor this story isn't now quite what they're telling me. And I think for all three of us, that is really important to not then kind of go away and try and none of us would then go away and try and manipulate it into the story we thought it was. Like, the key to doing it well is listening to people, and I think kind of being aware of that is a conversation that we have with ourselves, and that we sort of do routinely do and are willing to do.
And then a question to all three of you before we throw questions out to the audience is, what is the media's responsibility and involvement in this crisis for homeless children?
I'd probably, after despite my comment earlier, we're not campaigners, so that we're not. Our job is not to. It's a really fine line, and I think I've watched your work over the years as well, and I always respect Michael the fact that you don't. You always find the way of giving the facts and letting the viewer decide what the story is, and that effectively is our job. It may look like, if you're watching, it may look like they are kind of championing or advocating for the person you're featuring. I mean, that is up to the viewer to decide what they think. Our job is to expose what's happening and give people that space. The one thing I would say, and I don't think this is championing, is I think we do have a responsibility to give people a voice who don't have one. So what I would say is that dealing with lots of landlords, whether it's private landlord or whether it's a housing association or a council, as tied to the Arthur resource, they have PR departments, they have press officers, they have people paid to put that council's position across, to put that landlord's position across. If you look into housing associations, they have the National Housing Federation, who are there to represent all those bodies. They pay into them, and they're there, and they're paid a decent wage to speak on behalf of those organisations. The tenants we meet do not have anyone advocating for them. There is not a kind of an equivalent body. It's why Quajo's work has been so powerful, because there are so few people like Quajo willing to give people the time and space to speak. But there is a divide between what we do and what Quajo does, and our job, I think, at times is to make sure we stay on that side of the fence, because I think the minute we start to our viewers and actually to politicians look like we've picked a side, our work starts to become less powerful. I think part of our power is we are objective. We are trying to be down the middle here. So I think our role is to report these stories, but also remember that the power we have shouldn't turn into campaigning, because then I think it does lose a bit of its effectiveness.
Yeah.
Anna? I agree completely in the sense that it's about giving voice to people who don't easily have it. I think fundamentally that is our role in it. I think in my current job, and in terms of the way that what I would add is kind of asking the difficult questions about why something isn't happening, and kind of holding power to account over that, in the sense that, and which I think is possible to do without campaigning, looking at why a situation is the way it is, why people are living in these situations, and what is going on, and kind of going, there are structures and things that can change, and picking the bits that can change asking the difficult questions and kind of not really taking no for an answer around them.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael.
I just sort of follow both of that, but in particular Dan's point, in the sense that my job is absolutely not to change government policy. My job is to tell the government and the broader population some of the issues that are out there that perhaps that people perhaps should be thinking about, so that if politicians and governments choose not to do anything about it, that is their choice. But at least I've made them aware that there is an issue that they could consider. But my job is to raise awareness of particular issues, but it absolutely isn't to campaign for a particular government policy or a change in government policy at all. I may meet a government minister and I may challenge them from a perspective that if you were listening to the entire interview, you think, well, he just wants the government to spend billions of that. But you'd have to see that interview in a much broader context. One particular interview does not give an insight into one particular story, and I think the challenge is always to make it fair, to make it rounded, but to make it powerful. Because I think if you make it rounded, fair, and powerful, you've got a chance of impacting the national conversation. And I was asked this question recently as well, and I referenced Quajo on this because people are saying, well, how do we get to journalists and journalists like us three? And obviously, we are much more accessible than we maybe were 10 or 15 years ago. So it's not that difficult. But actually, people like Quajo, I would regard you as a citizen journalist. If you have got the skill, the passion, the commitment, and the energy that people like Quajo have, you can impact your own life as well. And you don't necessarily have to wait for journalists to come into your life if you have got the skills and the determination to do it. The world is very different to what it was even when I started setting up, when I started looking at these sort of issues about a decade or so ago. And I think I appreciate that being in temporary accommodation is a stressful environment to be in. But if people have got that energy, their access to social media means that they can actually contact the wider world and get in touch with politicians directly without going through professional journalists.
Thank you.